Good day, Western Civ 2 students. Last lecture we talked about Ronald Reagan and his rise and perceived success as president. He would leave office a popular president. One of the principal reasons he would have such a positive reputation in history, though, is international affairs, the Cold War. Now, as I said, early in his term, a lot of people thought of him as an extreme Cold Warrior, maybe a hothead, maybe dangerous. He came in using rhetoric all the time about the evil empire and so on. This was not an act. Ronald Reagan truly did believe that communism was an evil force in the world, and that, individual liberty is a very good thing, which I certainly endorse. And communism did a bunch of very, very bad things. Tens of millions of people died because of it. So I guess I share that assessment of communism. But a lot of people thought that he was too reckless in the early days. But with the growth of our military and military preparedness, the Soviets actually began to simmer down a bit. I guess because they knew that we were not an easy pushover anymore. You could say the buildup did exactly what Ronald Reagan wanted it to do. But there was another factor to put in the mix. Two other factors, really. One's on our end and one's on the Soviet end. On our end, Ronald Reagan was presented with a technological vision of a world where America would not need to be in fear of Soviet nuclear attack. Now, I know you've heard of the duck and cover drills and the like. Ask your grandparents, if not your parents. They will remember these days when we very much worried we would be attacked by the Soviet Union. My elementary school days in the 70s, high school and college days in the 80s, it was very much in the air. In the early 1980s, in the early Reagan years, there was a TV program called The Day After, which it was a mini-series on television, tried to depict a fairly realistic way in which World War III could start, and then a nuclear bomb blowing up over Lawrence, Kansas, as just one city in America out of thousands that would have suffered a similar fate, and the survivors, crawling through the rubble trying to stay alive. It was horrifying, and it was a very real concern in the mid-1980s. Ronald Reagan was presented with a vision of a technology based partly in outer space, mostly in outer space in the original vision, that we could put satellites in orbit that would shoot down missiles coming at the United States before they could blow up here. That we could put a kind of a technological dome over America to protect us. There were other components that were like lasers launched from the surface of the Earth and so on, but this vision was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, officially, Strategic Defense Initiative. The population in general, though, called it, part jokingly, Star Wars. You remember the Star Wars movies. The third movie hadn't even been released, I don't think, when this became news. So, Star Wars very much in people's minds, taking war to outer space, Star Wars. But Ronald Reagan very sincerely believed this was a possibility for the United States to develop. And his vision was that we would actually share this technology so no one would have to fear these missiles anymore. Now, we know that it was a lot harder than people thought in the mid-1980s to shoot down incoming missiles. By the way, we do have a technology that can do it about half the time now. We don't launch them from outer space, we launch them from the ground. But it can be done. I've heard it compared to like trying to shoot a bullet with another bullet while it's speeding past, but it can be done. And but it took us decades to get there. It wasn't something that was going to happen overnight or during Ronald Reagan's presidency. But the Soviets didn't know that. They didn't know how long it was going to take us. They hadn't seen us do amazing things. We put men on the moon. So it was possible we could pull it off in the short term. And this terrified the Soviets. Why? Because they couldn't possibly compete. They couldn't possibly do something like that. Their economy was going bankrupt. You turned on the nightly news in the 80s and you saw story after story about lines of people waiting in bread for hours waiting in line for hours to buy a loaf of bread. No meat for a week in Soviet markets. It was clear the Soviet economy was in a terrible shape by the mid-1980s. So they could not possibly compete with us in a high technology race the way they'd once done in the space race. And the Soviets knew this. Now, the Soviets had been, I think it's fair to say, cursed in the late 70s and early 80s by leadership by extremely old men. People who had worked their way up through the Politburo, the top layers of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and they tended to come to power when they were in their 80s already. They had 3 leaders die in less than a year and a half in the Soviet Union. Eventually, though, they elected a much younger man, a man I believe still in his early 50s, who was a vigorous fellow, but more than that, a man of new ideas, of brand new ideas for a Soviet communist leader. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev is one way you can write his name, Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev believed the Soviet Union had to change in order to survive. He didn't want to do away with communist rule. He was still a convinced communist. But he felt like it was too top-heavy. All the commands in this command economy came from the highest levels. And, you had people in Moscow trying to tell factories in Siberia what minor parts they had to manufacture to ship all the way across the country to go into something else, which will then be shipped somewhere else and they go somewhere else. And all this had to be done by planning by human beings. That's what a command economy is. Our market forces do that for us automatically in a capitalist economy. But in their economy, you had people at the top having to plan everything. He said, this just doesn't work. We have to devolve decision-making down to a more local level. And we need to, at the most local level, allow a measure of, he didn't call it capitalism, but he did say individual enterprise. So that his idea was to have barber shops and hair salons and a local market that were actually for-profit enterprises owned by individuals. Those have been banned back when the Soviet Revolution happened, right, in 1917. But he wants to bring them back because he says they're simply more efficient and they produce more goods. And, for example, they gave people the right to grow food on little plots of land and sell it in open markets and make a profit. They found that those little plots of land produced like a third of the food in the country by the 3rd year because people were working for their own profit. So this restructuring of the economy is called Perestroika in Russian. Perestroika, restructuring. But he also thought the Communist Party was too hidebound. It was too stuck in its old ways. And many of those ways he believed were very inefficient. But people were afraid to criticize. I mean, heck, there were times you could go to a labor camp for the rest of your life for criticizing the Soviet Communist Party. So that people were very frightened to say anything negative about anything that was going on and the party was involved with. And Gorbachev thought, we'll never be able to reform the party and make things work better if people are afraid to even voice a constructive criticism. So he wanted to open things up for constructive criticism and give people in the Soviet Union, for the very first time since 1917, well, even the czars didn't let them have true free speech, for the very first time to have something approaching the free speech rights you and I have. Not really truly like ours, but a lot more freedom to just complain or make suggestions and not get in trouble for it. This was called openness, glasnost, Glasnost, glasnost. So Gorbachev stood for Perestroika, restructuring the economy, and glasnost, openness to public discourse. So this was a different kind of Soviet leader. And because he was very worried about the SDI potential, that they could lose the cover that he believed they were provided by having all these missiles, that America might be able to attack them without worrying about a Soviet missile counterstrike, that he began serious negotiations with Ronald Reagan to reduce the number of nuclear missiles. It was a rocky road. The Soviets kept insisting we had to scrap SDI as part of any deal. But eventually, Ronald Reagan triumphed on that, got to keep his SDI, and intermediate range missiles were essentially eliminated. And long range missiles cut back in their numbers under agreements reached during the second Reagan administration. So one spectacular achievement of Ronald Reagan as president was 2 arms control treaties, which actually, in one case, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, and in the other, significantly reduced their numbers. Not to mention protocols being put in place to make it less likely we'd accidentally get in a nuclear war. So all that, I mean, how could you not be in favor of that? Gorbachev came to the United States on a very positive visit. Reagan went to Moscow shortly before he left office, very positive visit. What had begun the Reagan administration with people in fear of World War III ended where people no longer thought it was very, very likely we'd go to war with the Soviets. That would already be a major accomplishment for Reagan as president. But there's more. Now, it actually happened right after he left office. George H.W. Bush, his vice president, was elected president in November 1988, my apologies. And what happened in the fall of 1989. But Reagan gets a lot of the credit. Not long before he left office, he went to Berlin. Remember, Berlin had been divided between a Soviet sector and the free Western sector. And it was surrounded by the Berlin Wall by the Soviets, so people couldn't freely get out of East Germany. Well, by the East Germans with Soviet backing. People couldn't flee communism. They were trapped. Ronald Reagan went there, and he challenged Gorbachev, a man whom he had moderately positive relationship at the time. He said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." You've probably seen that. It's probably the most famous thing he ever said. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," meaning the Berlin Wall. Well, Gorbachev didn't tear down the wall, but glasnost and perestroika going on in the Soviet Union did spill over into the communist satellite states of Eastern Europe. First in Poland. Poland had already had an upsurge in sentiment for an independent trade union called Solidarity. It had been repressed violently by the Polish army, but there was an independent streak among the Poles that was unique among the communist satellites of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. And when glasnost and perestroika came to the Soviet Union, a lot of Polish people said, "Hey, we should have that here." And they started going in the streets demanding it. Now, the Polish Communist Party thought they were relatively popular with the people. They were wrong. They thought they would be okay. So they actually agreed to elections, competitive elections. And by George, in the summer of 1989, they had them. And the communists lost. Now, you might think, oh, the Soviets will never let the communists lose power in Poland. But the new party that was coming in, Solidarity, said, we won't break our alliance with the Soviet Union militarily. And Gorbachev, being committed to openness and wanted to be seen by the world as a fair man, let Poland have its free parliament. A freely elected prime minister who is not a communist. That happened in the summer of 1989. And this caused ripple effects all over Eastern Europe as people said, hey, Gorbachev didn't crush them when they reached for more freedom. Maybe he wouldn't us either. East Germans, who were the ones most under the boot of a hard-nosed dictator in Northern Europe, began trying to they went into the streets protesting. Now, the East German police did go after them with billy clubs and beating people and stuff. But a lot of East Germans said, we've got to find a way to get out of this. Now, the East Germans did try to calm people down. They said, well, we will let people go on vacations to other socialist countries. They were trying to simmer their people down by giving them a little treat. You get to go to vacation. You can go to Hungary or Romania or Poland on vacation if you want. So you're being stuck here all the time. Well, people quickly realized the Hungarian communists are letting their border to Austria remain more open than it had been. They're not guarding it with guard dogs and machine gun units anymore. And East Germans began going to Hungary and sneaking across the border into Austria, because they could go to Hungary and visit, and then they just run into Austria to freedom. And this was happening more and more, and finally the East Germans said, oh no, look what's happening, and tried to shut it down, and this just caused enormous demonstrations in the streets. And that is when the communists in East Germany made their big mistake. One night, trying to calm down the huge protests, they said, okay, we are going to make it possible for you to go on short visits to West Germany, to free West Germany. You'll be able to go on short visits to West Germany. But the guy in the foreign ministry spokesman that night had not been properly briefed. And they were broadcasting on East German television, and a reporter asked him, when does this go into effect? Now, the plan for it to be, you had to fill out paperwork and do all this, be vetted, make sure you weren't a risk, and then you might get a visa for a couple of weeks down the road. But the guy on TV said, I guess it goes into effect right now. And people began streaming to the Berlin Wall wanting through. They began pouring in by the thousands wanting to go visit West Berlin that night. And the border guards don't know what to do. And finally, one of them just raised the gate, and people began pouring through. And once the word got out in one gate that they were pouring through, the other guards raised their gate. And in the middle of the night, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall was effectively useless. And East Germans were pouring by the tens of thousands into free West Germany. And people were dancing on the wall and going after it with sledgehammers. The night the Berlin Wall fell, ask anybody who was over 10 that night, and they will remember it. It was huge news, huge news. But it wasn't the last. Czechoslovakia, people began pouring into the streets of Prague. It became known as the Velvet Revolution, totally peaceful protests. The communists in Czechoslovakia called out the army. And you have pictures of these soldiers, these young men with their guns and their helmets standing there, and these protesters are singing peace songs and handing them flowers. And then one night, they said, oh, let's just go in the palace and put a proper leader on the throne. And the people began pressing against the soldiers, and the soldiers said, forget it, we're not going to shoot them. And they joined the crowd. And the crowd rushed into the presidential palace, and the communists ran in terror for their lives. And communism ended essentially overnight without a shot being fired in Czechoslovakia. A few weeks later, Hungary's communists also gave up. The only place and Bulgaria's also fell about a month later. The only place in Eastern Europe where communism didn't go peacefully was in Romania. And the Romanian dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, who'd been in power for decades, was a maniac. He thought he was like a god on earth. He really did. He was crazy. And he had this enormous palace built with a huge courtyard and bleachers. And he would have people bust in from like coal mines and stuff every week to harangue them for 3 hours about how great he was and how great communist Romania was. And as the rest of Europe is being freed from the communist yoke, one day a bunch of coal miners were sitting there listening to his speech, and they began shouting out mockery at him. And Ceausescu, you can see the footage, he doesn't know what they're saying at first, and somebody leans over and tells him that they're insulting him by chants, and the whole crowd, like 100,000 people, is chanting insults at him. And eventually he goes in, and the crowd starts laughing, and they start streaming into the palace. And Ceausescu had to run for his life as the soldiers there refused to fire on them. And he escapes, But then units of the army declared a rebellion against him, a revolt for freedom. Other units of the army, unfortunately, stayed loyal to Ceausescu. So you did have a civil war that lasted about 2.5 weeks in Romania, which was very bloody, very bad. A lot of people died in that short time. Cities were bombed. It was bad. But eventually, Ceausescu was captured by revolutionary forces. He and his wife were tried on TV. I literally watched it on CNN as it was going on. They were tried for crimes against the Romanian people in a 10-minute long trial by these military units, taken outside against the wall and shot with the AK-47s. They were dead. After Ceausescu was dead, the resistance to the revolution disappeared pretty quickly, and Romania, too, saw the end of communism. So between mid-November and the end of 1989, all of the formerly communist countries of Eastern Europe were freed from communism. All of them. In March of 1990, divided Germany would be reunited peacefully after free and fair elections. So Germany has been a united country now for 30 years, thanks to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism in Eastern Europe. And Ronald Reagan, many people give him a lot of the credit for that. He wasn't president anymore, and George H.W. Bush did a very good job. He's a very experienced international diplomat. He did a very good job of managing things on the American end to make sure things stayed peaceful and calm and freedom came. It was a great time to be alive, brothers and sisters. It really was. The end of communism in Eastern Europe was a miracle. There was even a song that came out talking about somebody sitting there watching on TV as the world woke up from history. It really was. I couldn't imagine when I was a boy that Germany would ever be reunited. And yet it happened in 1990 without a shot being fired. Freedom for hundreds of millions of people. It was great. The Soviet Union will fall in 1991. That's the next lecture. God bless, guys.